Today in Shield Hero Cut content, we're gonna cover only episode 13 because at this point in the anime, a lot of things start to pick up and the story gets a bit more rushed in an attempt to cover more ground. For context, a normal episode of Shield Hero typically covers 2 to 3 chapters from the light novel. Episode 13 covers 10, most of which were used to describe events from the scenes where Naofumi and his party had their backs against the wall as they were about to be captured. These made that particular scenario a whole lot more intense and action-packed than what we were shown in the anime. So let's take a look at what that should have been like. But first, as you can tell by the epic cinematic, Raid Shadow Legends has been kind enough to sponsor yet another one of my videos, which if you don't remember, it's a brand new free-to-play mobile RPG, complete with a fantastic storyline, high-quality 3D graphics, giant boss fights, PvP battles, and hundreds of champions to collect and customize. And right now, they're having a global Raid Shadow Legends special tournament, where you can compete against me or millions of other players in a massive arena tournament, with not only some crazy in-game prizes, but also physical ones that will get delivered straight to the winners' houses. So this is definitely the best time to get in on the action. So feel free to use my link in the description and download Raid today, where you'll then immediately receive 50,000 silver and a free epic champion, courtesy of the new player program. Oh, and you'll automatically be entered into the special launch tournament. So I wish you the best of luck. Now, let's get back to the video. Episode 13, The Demon of the Shield, covering chapters 19 to 21 from the manga, and literally the rest of volume 3 in the light novels. We start from the point where Melty was about to be attacked by her soldiers. As we saw, Naofumi was able to fend off the attack, and he even captured a few soldiers for interrogation. The first thing he finds out is that they're very religious fanatics, devout followers of the Church of the Three Heroes, the most prominent religious sect in all of Melromark. Of course, there were other religions, like Raftalia mentions how back in her village, their religion was different from these soldiers, giving us a little insight into how religious beliefs seem to be a far-reaching concept throughout the country. As he questions these soldiers, Naofumi finds on one of them the rosary with the church's insignia, which, if you couldn't quite tell in the anime, it was basically all 3 weapons overlapped with each other at a central point. Naofumi understands that it's a sacred symbol, and he uses it as an opportunity to try to get more information. By doing what, you ask? Well, he places the rosary on the ground, and he tells the prisoners that he's going to stomp on it if they don't tell him what he wants to know. If these soldiers were as faithful as they said they were, they should do anything to prevent this so-called demon from stepping on a sacred object. Unfortunately though, pretending to step on it only caused the soldiers to squirm. They weren't so easily broken, so Naofumi just ended up crushing the rosary for their lack of cooperation. He then leaves them and goes to talk to a fairly shook Melty. She was scared and shaking, unsure as to why someone would send these people after her. Only after Philo comforts her does she calm down and start to think about the situation rationally. Naofumi believes that this was the work of the king, but Melty disagrees. You see, the king was actually quite the strategist. When he played strategy games, no one could beat him, not even the queen. Meaning that if this was his plan, then Melty would already be dead since the likelihood of it failing would have been slim to none. Though any plan that the king comes up with would have to pass through Melty's mother first, the queen, and she certainly would not have approved of this type of action, which is what led Melty to the conclusion that it was in fact her sister that coordinated this plot. It becomes known to us that ever since a young age, Mine had been known to do pretty much anything in order to get what she wanted. Though, throughout the years, her father never really became aware of this manipulative trait that Mine possessed. He was being fooled his entire life by this supposedly sweet-hearted daughter. Only their mother and Melty were aware of Mine's true nature, resulting in this weird royal family dynamic that we see throughout the series. It's a story that leads up to the revelation of Melromark having a matrilineal kinship, a system where the descent of people in power is determined by the female line, essentially meaning that the queen is more powerful than the king. Realizing that the king was only royalty because he had married into it caused Naofumi to burst out into laughter. This made Melty lose her usual royal composure, and she began to act in a manner that was actually fitting to her age for once. You see, because Naofumi was saying so many mean things about her father, she starts to throw a temper tantrum, and even cries as we see here in the manga. Now, we're still developing Melty's character here, but it should be clear that she really does love her family. Yeah, even mine. So, after Raftalia scolded Naofumi for making her cry, he changes the subject and asks Melty if the queen could make things right. At least the queen seemed like a more reasonable person than the king. We're even told that she wanted to befriend the shield hero. However, that couldn't happen at the moment because she was too busy maintaining diplomatic relations and trying to avoid wars. A small tidbit of information that briefly highlights the supposedly fragile current state of affairs, something that we learned stemmed from the occurrence of the waves. With no available options, Naofumi racks his brain to figure out the true intentions of this assassination plot. That's when he remembered that there was a soldier holding a crystal ball, the camera-like magic item that also seems to come packaged with Adobe Premiere. While remembering this, he realized that their plan was intended to ruin his image, not only in Melromark but also in every other country. The reason for that was because before this event, there was no proof behind any of the Crown's accusations. Even within Melromark, not every person had turned their back on the shield. And if Naofumi was to travel to another country, then it'd be even more unlikely that the citizens there would blame him or even be aware of his past accusations, meaning that he could likely make many allies. And that was something that the king absolutely could not allow. So by having this visual evidence, that was all the proof they needed to prevent any other country from supporting the shield hero, leaving Naofumi essentially helpless no matter where he went. That's why we see these soldiers going all over the map to spread the lies about Naofumi. Now understanding the whole picture, Naofumi was impressed by the depth to this defamation plot, and he was only able to come up with 3 potential options. Option 1. Leave the princess and run away. The princess would likely die at the church's or mine's hands, pinning Naofumi as the perpetrator of the crime and turning the queen against him, resulting in no country being willing to support him, and they'd constantly have to be on the run, likely captured when teleported to the next wave. So that wasn't really a great option. Option 2. Take the princess back to the king and try to explain the situation. Melty would live, but he couldn't guarantee the safety of himself or Philo and Raftalia. There was the possibility that the queen could save him should the king try to arrest them, but that was still a risk that Naofumi would rather not take. Plus, given Naofumi's doubting nature, he was still considering the possibility that the queen could be behind this plot as well. Option 3. Go back to the castle and kill the king. Sure, all his past offenses would disappear, but then he'd be hunted by the heroes and the church for the rest of his life. So realistically, none of these options seemed reasonable, and none of them even proved his innocence. So Naofumi had to think outside the box. That's when he realized that Siltveld wasn't that far from where they were. Remember, that was a demi-human supremacist society, which meant that they likely didn't have close ties with Melromark. He could use Raftalia to get into the country and then negotiate with Melromark from there. So that's where he decided to head towards. Unlike in the anime, they're actually able to travel by carriage for a little bit. Under normal circumstances, Philo would have been immediately recognized, but as it turns out, she's actually able to transform into a normal-looking Filolio, an ability that we didn't know that Philo had, putting into question what other transformations that she might have up her sleeve. Anyway, while traveling like this, the same bandits from last time try to ambush them again, unaware that it was the shield hero that they were jumping. However, you'd think that after seeing Naofumi that they'd just run away, but there were a few new recruits, so some of them were still eager to fight. As they charged in to attack, Melty steps out and casts her All's-White Aqua Shot spell. Which brings us to a point in the novel where they give us some information on how the casting of spells work in this universe. You see, low-tier spells like Heal or Guard are cast by saying the word first before it, which is why most spells are said like First Heal or First Guard. The word isn't actually meant to be fast, like how they translated it in the anime. It's first, because the next tier of medium-level spells are led into with Zweit, which in German means second. And following that same naming convention, we have the highest level of spells, which is led into with the word Zweit, meaning third. So with regards to Melty's All's-White Aqua Shot, that meant that it was a medium-level spell, and the All converted it from single target to multi-target. This spell was strong enough to take out whatever bandits that it hit. Then the rest of the bandits were easily taken care of after that. And because they didn't want to get eaten by Philo, they guided Naofumi to their hideout. He quickly claims it as his own, eats their food, steals some of their stolen goods, then ends up resting there for the night. It's here that we find out a bit more about the royal family's affinity to magic. Melty, who's a level 18 user of magic, can proficiently cast all mid-level water magic, as well as use a bit of earth magic when needed. Mine is apparently most skilled at fire magic, and she can use a bit of wind magic too. Then their mother, the queen, can use both fire and water magic. Now, for reference, just in case you're lost, we're pretty much at this point in the anime. The cave that we see here is essentially the base that they're hiding in the novels. So when the next day comes, they make their approach on a heavily secured border checkpoint, one that was much too secure to sneak past, and apparently every checkpoint was the same. It seemed like they were expecting Naofumi to attempt a crossover into Siltveld. It's not like they could sneak across at an unwatched location either. Melty had mentioned that there are emergency systems in place all across the border that would trigger an alarm should they try to cross anywhere that isn't a checkpoint. It was definitely an expensive system to maintain, but the Queen insisted on keeping it for emergencies. It was here that they had to abandon the carriage and put on disguises, because really that was the only way that they'd possibly get across. Luckily, some villagers who he helped a few episodes back were able to provide him and the rest with some clothing. Then, as they were getting themselves ready, another ally, a soldier who was in his party during the wave, also spotted him. He approaches Naofumi, and he tells them that at least half the soldiers of Malremark are stationed all across the checkpoints. Even the three heroes were waiting here just for him, making it much more clear that there was definitely something in Siltveld that the king didn't want Naofumi to reach. But he couldn't just barge his way through, especially now that the three heroes were there too. They had even gone through the class up process, so they were much more powerful than they were during the glass fight. Regardless, Naofumi had to attempt to cross anyway, so they finished up changing their outfits, and they attempted to sneak past the checkpoint. But not more than a few moments later, they're spotted by some nearby wizards that were using scouting magic. With the three heroes being nearby, they immediately rush over to block off Naofumi's escape, demanding that he return the princess, and bringing us to the confrontation that we see in the anime. Melty almost convinces them to back down, but then Mind brings up the brainwashing shield, backing it up with the absurdity of all these random villagers praising the shield hero for all his supposed help, something that the soldiers and other heroes assumed were not characteristic to Naofumi, cause after Mind's accusations, then why would they? It brought enough doubt to the situation that it made them disregard their previous thoughts. This led to the bargaining. In order to avoid a conflict, Naofumi was willing to give up Melty if they could guarantee her safety and investigate his claims of Mind setting him up from the beginning. Ren, being the only reasonable one, was the only one out of the three heroes to agree. Naofumi was actually about to trust that his conditions would be met, but very faintly, he hears Melty softly whimper that she'd probably still end up being killed. That's when he realized that, yeah, they're definitely just gonna kill Melty and pin the blame on him anyway. Probably by saying that they were removing the brainwashing, but then a curse that Naofumi had planted activated, which caused Melty to die. It was a far too obvious setup, and Naofumi just couldn't trust Ren's words. So, as we saw in the anime, he uses Philo to try to get away, but is then caught by Motuyasu's item that prevents Philo from transforming, taking away their only escape option. It even sealed her magical powers, making Philo essentially useless in this fight. Now, here's where things start to pick up, because this is where the anime begins to diverge from the novel, and the fight becomes much more eventful. You see, after Melty had used her water magic as a threat, it distracted Motoyasu enough for Philo to get away from him. Unfortunately though, this resulted in Motoyasu being in range of Melty, so he was able to take her captive and he handed her over to Mine. Naofumi was able to recover Philo, but at the same time, he had lost Melty, and he could only watch as she struggled in an attempt to get away from her sister. So with Mine being distracted by that, Naofumi saw an opportunity. He switched to a Shield of Rage, then cast Shield Prison on Motoyasu. He then proceeded with the steps to cast Iron Maiden, and he used the ability to try and take out Motoyasu from the fight. Trust me, he wanted to do it on Mine instead, but he knew that unlike Motoyasu, it's likely that she wouldn't survive an attack like that. I mean, even the other heroes didn't think that Motoyasu was going to survive that attack, because as the Iron Maiden was about to shut itself, every soldier plus Ren and Itsuki shifted their focus on it and attacked it all at once, destroying it in the process and freeing Motoyasu. This made the situation a lot more dire because, remember, Philo still couldn't fight, Melty was still captured, and Naofumi now had no SP to use any skills. You might be wondering why, if the Shield of Rage is active, then why isn't Philo going out of control like she did last time? Well, the reason for that is because of the artifact around her leg. It also prevented magic from affecting her body from the outside. There was a red aura emanating from the shield towards Philo, but it would just bounce right off her once it got there. And it's not like they could break the artifact either. They couldn't seem to just rip it off by brute force. So that's when Philo decides to pull out the weapon shop owner's gloves. She goes over to Motoyasu and demands that he give her back Melty. Motoyasu, being unaware of the glove's magical properties, simply brushes off the threat. He then runs over to Philo with his arms wide open, leaving his gut open for a massive sucker punch. With Motoyasu temporarily out of the fight again, Naofumi briefly calls everyone back to come up with a plan. Philo would continue to take care of Motoyasu, and Naofumi would distract Ren and Itsuki while Raphtalia snuck behind for a sneak attack. Meanwhile, Mine had brought out a medicine and she was forcing Melty to smell it. It was likely something that would either knock her out or just kill her right there. So everyone had to act fast. Philo immediately engaged Motoyasu again, and this time her gloves had hardened and they gained fangs due to some sort of magic. Then Ren and Itsuki were very careful with dealing with Naofumi because his shield of rage was still active. Ren didn't even seem like he wanted to fight. He looked as if he was carefully considering the situation before him, trying to understand what was going on. Itsuki, on the other hand, had already blindly accepted that Naofumi was the enemy, but he didn't charge in either. He looked like he wanted to go help Motoyasu, though Itsuki wasn't the type of person to interrupt a 1v1, so he let them be. Unfortunately for Motoyasu, he got his ass handed to him, and he was taken out of the fight long enough for Philo to rush over to Melty and get her back from Mine. Now, instead of immediately running back to Naofumi, Philo decides to re-engage Motoyasu one last time, because somehow he had recovered himself yet again. So the fight was now a 2-on-2, Philo and Melty versus Mine and Motoyasu. Everyone else had stopped, and they watched as this went on. Melty and Mine began to cast their spells at each other, but it wasn't long before other soldiers had started firing their attacks at Melty as well. This caused Ren to have to step in order to counter their attacks. He questioned why they were attacking their princess, when their #1 priority should be to protect her. He also told Mine that she needs to be way more considerate of Melty's level, since a direct attack from her would likely prove to be fatal. You see, this entire time, Melty was merely firing warning shots, never once fighting with the intention of hurting anyone. They were all meant to be empty threats. This was in contrast to Mine, who fought with every intention to kill. Naofumi, who had noticed this, used it as an opportunity to prove his case yet again. Mine's actions were far too blatant and obvious now. There should be no doubt that she was clearly trying to get rid of Melty. However, Mine just plays the brainwashing card yet again, after which her personal soldiers start to lead a charge towards Naofumi, triggering his self-burning curse. It made Naofumi seem untouchable, so Ren and Itsuki figure that there's no way that they could beat that shield. They both put their weapons away and they seemed like they were going to be done attacking. It may have just been for a moment, but when Naofumi saw this, he momentarily let his guard down, and it was at that same moment that he got simultaneously struck by both Ren and Itsuki's ranged attacks. Ren had used the 100 sword skill, and Itsuki the arrow rain skill. Both sent multiple swords and arrows flying towards a target. This ended up doing a fair bit of damage to Naofumi, and it made Ren and Itsuki realize that the curse shield's weakness was distance. Itsuki quickly followed up with another skill called Eagle Piercing Shot. It was an arrow surrounded by magical energy that made it look like an eagle, and it gave it additional piercing damage. Naofumi knew that due to its piercing nature, he wouldn't be able to defend against it, so instead, he focused on the arrow itself. He watched as it approached him, then right when it was about to make impact, he lets the tip pass by, and he quickly closes his fist around the neck of the arrow, catching it right out of midair. Now, that honestly would have been quite the badass scene to see animated in the anime, but it actually didn't even make it into the manga. However, needless to say, Itsuki was in shock, and it gave Naofumi time to renegotiate once again. Though, before he could sway them anymore, reinforcements began to arrive, and Mine had started to cast a massive fireball spell with their assistance. Ren tried to get them to stop, but Mine insisted that if Naofumi was to talk for any longer, then they'd all end up brainwashed. Now, this was no ordinary fireball. This was a massive attack that would definitely kill Melty should it hit her. Luckily, Raphtalia was finally able to sneak behind everyone, and she was able to stop the follow-through of the attack. But it wasn't with the mana sword like how we saw in the anime. Mine had actually been stabbed for real. Raphtalia used her physical sword to stab Mine right through her shoulder. Ren saw this, and he immediately rushed over to help Mine, who was now furious at what just happened. Unfortunately, Raphtalia's sword was still stuck in Mine's shoulder, so she had to use her backup one against Ren. But that didn't change much because Ren was the far greater fighter, and he quickly disarmed Raphtalia, leaving her defenseless. Naofumi tried to go and help, but he was being held back by a massive barrage of arrows. This left Raphtalia desperate, so she had no other option but to pull out her magic sword of only a hilt. Mine, who had now been healed, mocked Raphtalia for her supposedly useless looking weapon. Ren and Itsuki, on the other hand, were a little bit more wary. They knew that this was a magic sword, one that forms a blade from the user's own magic energy. It can give the illusion of a blade on the user's command, but can also disappear just as easily. It also doesn't cut physical objects, but instead it causes mental damage. Ren had to be careful with this fight, but at the same time, he also didn't want to hurt anyone either, only disarm them. To do that, he wasn't fighting very seriously, but it was still likely that any skill he used would prove to be fatal against Raphtalia. That's just how much the power difference between them was. So he poorly aims his shooting star sword skill towards Raphtalia, giving her the opportunity to dodge, and it brought her close enough to Ren to let her luckily land a hit with her magic sword, bringing Ren down to his knees. Raphtalia then charges Mine once more. Mine attempts to attack with her own sword, but instead of clashing with Raphtalia's blade like she expected it to, it instead goes right through, throwing Mine off her balance. This was when Raphtalia was able to stab Mine right through the chest, causing enough mental damage to put her to sleep. The other three heroes saw this and they screamed because they thought that Mine had just been killed, but Raphtalia quickly explained that she was only unconscious. So with Mine now as her hostage, she tries again to get the other heroes to listen to what Naofumi had to say, but just like all the other times, they were interrupted. Mine's soldiers still thought that Raphtalia had killed her, so they immediately charged on their commander's orders. One of the soldiers who had fought with Naofumi during the wave tried to calm the commander down, but that's when the commander remembered that this soldier once fought with Naofumi. The commander drew his sword and he was about to kill the treacherous soldier right there, all while Naofumi was too far away to help at all. He could only watch. Naofumi's emotions began to rise as the thoughts of someone getting killed for speaking on his behalf filled his head. This increase in rage had caused the item that was covering the front orb of the shield to break. This created a massive light about 3 meters across to burst out from the shield. No soldier could pass through it and no attack could penetrate it. It seemed as if it was an impenetrable barrier. Fragments from the broken item burned in a black flame as it descended on the nearby enemies. The flames burned not only the soldiers but also Ren and Itsuki. This left Motoyasu as the only one who remained standing. He was still fighting Philo that entire time, but once he noticed that everyone else was taken out, he backed off and tried to get Mine away from Raphtalia. Raphtalia didn't want to let her go, but she couldn't defend herself and hold on to Mine at the same time. And before Naofumi could get over there to help, Motoyasu had already taken Mine away. Regardless, Naofumi had the upper hand, but he still didn't have any means of escape due to the artifact on Philo's leg. Suddenly, a smoke bomb appears at his feet, and the assassin-like shadow person jumps before them as a guide to help them escape. With this cover and the shadow's guidance, they were able to get far enough away to finally evade everybody else, bringing an end to what should have been a very epic fight. Now, if you were able to follow the whole thing through, it's clear that all Naofumi wanted to do was just talk things out, but he could never get a chance to fully explain the situation. Every time he started talking, Mine or the other soldiers would just cut him off. It's likely because Ren was starting to get suspicious, so they didn't want to have to worry about another hero not being on their side. It's something that you could say was captured in the anime with what they showed, but could have been expanded to make it much more entertaining. Anyway, the final scene of the episode brings us to the forest where they're now resting after a very lengthy fight. The Shadow introduces herself as what's essentially Melty's secret bodyguard. Then she proceeds to request that Naofumi visit the Queen. After giving it a lot of thought, he concludes that the Queen was someone that he could trust. At the very least, she seemed much more reasonable than the King, as she did prioritize peace over war and the waves over infighting. And now that Sildveld proved certainly not to be an option, then this was really the only place that he could go. But he couldn't help but imagine what was so important over there that the King had to send half his army to prevent him from passing. That's just something that we're going to have to wait to find out. But yeah, that's episode 13. Quite the lengthy one, but you guys said you wanted details, so that's what I gave. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!